Beneath the cities and meadows of Britain lies a silence older than memory. Every time a road crew cuts into the soil, a fragment of forgotten identity surfaces: a polished axe, a hearth of blackened stones, a skull aligned to the rising sun. These are whispers of lives that predate kings' chronicles and cathedrals. They hint at a Britain that existed long before the word Britain itself, a land layered with human stories lost to the written record. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Long before monks inked Latin on parchment or knights raised banners, these islands were home to communities whose names are unrecorded, yet whose fingerprints remain in every hill and valley. Archaeologists read those marks like faint constellations: hill forts sprawling atop ridges, burial mounds aligned with celestial patterns, causeways built over wetlands. The Mesolithic hunters who followed reindeer herds across frozen plains gave way to Neolithic farmers who cleared forests for crops. By around 4000 BCE, polished stone tools, pottery, and ceremonial structures appeared, marking one of the earliest agricultural revolutions in Europe's northwest corner. The most haunting evidence lies at sites such as Skara Brae in Orkney, where stone houses still hold the ghosts of daily life, beds built from slabs dressers facing the hearth, a civilization both simple and advanced. Here, centuries before the Great Pyramids, rose families watched Atlantic storms from windows cut into rock. At Avebury and Stonehenge, circular monuments aligned with solstices expressed a spiritual architecture that scholars still debate. They may have been calendars, temples, or places of the dead, but their builders shared a worldview, linking human time with cosmic rhythm. As the Bronze Age dawned around 2500 BCE, the island's inhabitants began to trade metalwork with continental Europe. Amber from the Baltic, copper from Ireland, and gold from Wales passed through hands that left no written trace. Tribal societies developed, ruled perhaps by chieftains whose power rested on control of these valuable resources. Burial mounds grew richer. Swords and jewelry accompanied the dead. To imagine this world, one must strip away the medieval castles and Roman roads, seeing only forests, wide rivers, and communities bound by kinship and ritual. The ancestors of medieval Britons were already shaping the land, defining boundaries, and building myths that would later feed Celtic lore. The shift into the Iron Age, around 800 BCE, deepened those cultural lines. Hill forts such as Maiden Castle and Danebury rose across southern England, symbols of both defense and prestige. The peoples of these islands were now speaking early Celtic languages, part of the vast Indo-European family stretching across Europe. The art of Latin, spirals, curves, and interlaced patterns flourished here, centuries before monks illuminated manuscripts with similar designs. It's tempting to imagine that the monks who later copied Latin texts were channeling patterns inherited from ancestors who had carved them into shields and torques. These Iron Age societies were complex farmers, metalworkers, traders, and priests bound by oral tradition. They worshipped in groves rather than temples, offering weapons and jewelry to rivers and lakes. The Thames has yielded entire caches of ritual deposits, perhaps gifts to unseen gods of water and fate. When classical writers finally described these people, they called them Britanni. But by then, their culture had already evolved for 1,000 years. Caesar's brief invasion in 55 BC noted fortified towns, chariots, and warriors painted with blue dye symbols of an island world already vibrant, not primitive. Modern excavations reveal that trade networks linked Britain with Gaul and even the Mediterranean. Amphorae bearing traces of wine and oil have been unearthed from Kent to Cornwall. The tribes of the southeast minted coins modelled on those of the Gauls, suggesting both imitation and ambition. Yet while commerce thrived, so did warfare. Tribal confederations like the Catuvellauni or the Iceni jockeyed for dominance. Their power, based on wealth and prestige, would later decide who allied with Rome and who resisted. One mystery that still teases historians is how these pre-Roman Britons viewed time. Without written records, we rely on patterns, alignments of monuments, cycles of offerings, seasonal feasts hinted at in later Celtic festivals. Samhain, Beltane, and Lughnasadh may preserve memories of Bronze Age rituals tied to harvest and renewal. The landscape itself became a mnemonic device: hills named for gods, rivers for spirits, groves for ancestors. Medieval saints would one day replace these deities, but their sanctuaries often occupied the same sacred ground. Beneath every parish church lies an older faith, its stones recycled yet never erased. The genetic record adds another layer. Modern studies suggest that waves of migration shaped early Britain, first hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age, then farmers from Anatolia, later Indo-European newcomers. Each left a trace, blending over millennia into a population both insular and cosmopolitan. That blend would later define medieval Britain's resilience, absorbing conquerors, yet remaining distinct. The very concept of Britishness was centuries from birth, but its raw ingredients were already present in these prehistoric experiments of coexistence and adaptation. The transition from prehistory to history is less a sudden dawn than a long twilight. Oral legends hardened into the myths that medieval chroniclers would later reshape. Figures like Brutus of Troy or King Lear emerged from the mist of collective memory, perhaps echoing genuine ancient leaders, perhaps pure invention. The medieval imagination would weave these legends into a seamless lineage, stretching from Troy to Arthur, erasing the chaotic truth of tribal origins. Yet archaeology now restores those forgotten faces, not through names, but through fingerprints, in clay footprints, in peat and genetic echoes in our bones. Long before any chronicler wrote of knights and kingdoms, the islands that would one day be called Britain pulsed with cultures the Romans barely understood. Across windswept hills and fertile valleys, Celtic-speaking tribes built societies of remarkable complexity, each with its own gods, heroes, and sacred landscapes. The Romans later called them Britanni, but their self-image was rooted not in a single identity, rather in kinship networks stretching from Ireland to Gaul. These were the peoples of the Isles before Rome, a mosaic of clans whose languages flowed like rivers, interwoven, yet distinct their spiritual world, shimmering with unseen presences. Archaeologists trace their story through patterns of settlement and craft. Hill forts stood as both refuge and display centers of power, where chieftains ruled and artisans forged bronze mirrors, swords, and brooches adorned with flowing motifs. Fields were cultivated by communities who understood the rhythm of soil and season, and who celebrated harvests with ritual feasts. In the Welsh uplands, fragments of round houses still cling to slopes once bright with grain. Across the Irish Sea, The same circular dwellings and art styles reveal that the Western islands shared a common language of design and belief. These tribes organized themselves into kingdoms, small shifting realms, whose boundaries followed rivers or forests more than written law. Among them were the Iceni of East Anglia, the Brigantes of northern England, the Silures of Wales, and the Durotriges of Dorset. Each had its own ruling lineage, often traced through mythic ancestors, linked to divine beasts or elements. Oral bards preserved genealogies, reciting them in rhythm and rhyme to ensure memory survived where ink did not. What little we know of their worldview comes from later echoes, Irish sagas, Welsh triads, and inscriptions in the mysterious Ogham script carved on standing stones. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The Celts saw no division between natural and supernatural realms. Rivers were goddesses, hills were guardians, and the sky was alive with divine currents. Sacred groves, rather than temples, served as places of worship. Offerings of dorks' weapons, or even human lives, were made to ensure fertility and victory. Classical writers, both fascinated and horrified, described druids as priests, judges, and keepers of knowledge. Though much of what was written was distorted by Roman propaganda, archaeological finds such as ritual pits, ceremonial cauldrons, and votive deposits in lakes confirm a deep ritual life tied to nature's cycles. Their art reveals a paradox of refinement and abstraction. Instead of depicting human forms, realistically Celtic craftsmen preferred swirling patterns and hidden faces that seemed to move as the metal caught the light. These designs, flowing like wind or water, captured a sense of motion beyond the static world. On shield stalks and pottery, they expressed continuity, the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Later, medieval manuscripts illuminated with similar knots and spirals would unknowingly preserve these ancient aesthetics. The continuity between pagan art and monastic calligraphy is one of the subtle threads linking prehistoric and medieval Britain. Trade bound these tribes to the continent. Along the southern coasts, ships carried salt grain and slaves to Gaul, returning with fine pottery, wine, and tools. Some British chieftains adopted continental customs, minting coins that bore stylized horses or abstract faces, early symbols of sovereignty. These coins, discovered in graves and hoards, shimmer as faint voices from an age that blended commerce and spirituality. The presence of Greek and Roman goods in British burials long before the invasion suggests that these so-called barbarians were neither isolated nor ignorant. They were participants in a wide evolving network that spanned much of Europe. Power among the tribes shifted constantly. Alliances formed through marriage, tribute, and warfare. A chieftain's prestige often depended on his ability to host lavish feasts, distributing food, jewelry, and weapons to reinforce loyalty. Poets sang of heroes whose generosity outlived them, and of warriors who sought glory in battle, not merely for conquest, but for remembrance. This social fabric of reciprocal honor would persist deep into the medieval era, visible in the feasting halls of Anglo-Saxon kings and the Arthurian tales that later reimagined Celtic ideals. Yet beneath the surface of communal life, omens of change were stirring. By the 1st century, BCE continental turmoil was rippling across the Channel. Caesar's conquest of Gaul pushed refugees, traders, and mercenaries toward Britain. Some tribes may have welcomed Roman merchants. Others bristled at the intrusion when Julius Caesar launched his brief invasions in 55 and 54 BCE, He found societies that were politically divided but militarily fierce. Chariots rattled across open fields, carrying warriors whose long hair and painted bodies were meant to terrify. Though Caesar departed the encounter, left a scar of curiosity and fear between Rome and the Isles. Over the following decades, trade intensified. British kings, such as Commius and Tasciovanus, minted coins inscribed in Latin characters, aligning themselves with Roman prestige while maintaining independence. The line between ally and subject blurred. When Claudius finally ordered the conquest, in 43 CE, Rome did not face a wild frontier, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms, some eager for alliance, others sworn to resist. The resulting collision of two worlds would reshape the Isles forever. But in this prelude, we glimpse the last moment before the tidal wave of empire rolled ashore. When Rome came north, the story of Britain changed forever. The legions arrived not as distant rumor, but as a thunderous reality, armored columns, glinting in mist, marching under banners of the eagle-crossing rivers that had been sacred since time immemorial. In 43 CE, Emperor Claudius launched the full invasion that Julius Caesar had only dreamed of. The Roman army landed in waves along the southeastern coast, and within months, the great tribal confederations of the south, once rivals, were forced to choose between alliance and annihilation. For the first time, the peoples of the Isles found themselves facing an empire that measured power not by ancestry or magic, but by discipline and road building. At first, the resistance was fierce. The Catuvellauni, led by Caratacus, fought a guerrilla war through the forests of Wales, drawing Rome deep into unfamiliar terrain. Roman generals like Ostorius Scapula built forts and roads to contain rebellion, creating lines of stone that still mark the landscape today. Caratacus was eventually betrayed and brought in chains to Rome, where his defiant speech impressed even Emperor Claudius. That image, a British warlord standing proud before marble columns, captured the paradox of conquest, defeat mingled with admiration, rebellion transformed into spectacle. The Romans advanced methodically, constructing towns that mirrored the geometry of their empire. Londinium rose near the Thames Verulamium, near modern St. Albans, and Eboracum in the north, future York, became a fortress of legions. Bath's hot springs were dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva, a hybrid deity who embodied both Celtic and Roman traits. Across the province, native elites adopted Roman architecture and dress while preserving local customs behind villa walls. Latin inscriptions appeared beside Celtic symbols, suggesting not replacement, but a strange coexistence. Britain became a frontier of fusion, where togas and talks mingled at the same banquet table. Yet the conquest was never complete. In 60 CE, Boudica of the Iceni widow of a client king rose against imperial brutality. Her daughters were assaulted, her people enslaved, and her wrath set half the province aflame. Cities burned, Camulodunum, Verulamium, Londinium, until the legions crushed her army in a final devastating battle. Her story, retold through Roman historians, became legend, a warrior queen whose vengeance turned empire to ashes. Even centuries later, medieval chroniclers would see in her the prototype of the defiant Briton, a symbol of native dignity against foreign domination. The conquest resumed pushing north and west. By the 70s, CE, most of southern Britain lay under Roman administration. The northern frontier, however, resisted. In the rugged lands of the Brigantes and Caledoni, the legions faced ambushes, shifting alliances, and an unforgiving climate. To secure the border, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of his wall around 122 C, a monumental line of stone and turf stretching over 70 miles from coast to coast. It was more than defense, it was statement. Beyond the wall lay the world of mist and myth, the untamed tribes of Caledonia. South of it stood the ordered province of Britannia, lit by Roman hearths. Life along that border was a rhythm of contrasts. Fortresses housed soldiers from Spain, Syria, and North Africa, men who spoke dozens of tongues yet served one empire. Native Britons traded with them, intermarried, and adopted aspects of their culture. Archaeological finds, altars to Mithras, inscriptions to local deities, fragments of imported glass reveal a society far more diverse than the medieval imagination ever suspected. Roman Britain was not a monolith. It was a patchwork, a living experiment in cultural blending that left deep roots in the soil. Within cities, Romanization took on a peculiar British flavor. Public baths and amphitheaters rose beside wooden huts and Celtic shrines. Villas dotted the countryside, their mosaic floors depicting mythic scenes in which Neptune's trident or Orpheus's lyre shimmered beside native motifs of birds and spirals. Roads connected all this to the broader empire, north to Iberacum, west to Caerleon, south to the ports of Dover. For nearly 4 centuries, this network of stone arteries pumped the lifeblood of Roman order through the British landscape. Religion too evolved under Roman influence. The old Celtic gods were not banished, but assimilated. Sulis merged with Minerva Nodens with Mars, and local spirits found new homes in Roman temples. When Christianity began to spread across the empire in the 4th century, it reached Britain quietly through merchants and soldiers. By the late 300s, small Christian communities existed in towns like Londinium and Lincoln, coexisting with pagan practices in a delicate balance. The future of medieval faith was already germinating in these frontier chapels. Still beneath the veneer of Roman civility, the ancient landscape persisted. Farmers continued to plow ancestral fields, speaking Celtic dialects, even as their sons served in Roman legions. The countryside remembered what the empire forgot. When Rome's grip began to loosen in the late 4th century, threatened by internal strife and barbarian invasions, the frontier towns were already fading. The wall crumbled, the roads fell silent, and the local elites who once feasted under painted ceilings returned to simpler ways. Britain had tasted empire, but it had not been consumed by it. The fall of empire never happens in a single night. In Britain, it unfolded like a long twilight years of fading light, where the memory of Rome lingered, but the warmth was gone. Around the early 5th century, imperial administration began to unravel. Garrisons along Hadrian's Wall were thinned as troops were recalled to defend Gaul and Italy from invasions that seemed endless. By 410 CE, the Emperor Honorius famously told the British towns to look to their own defense. It was both an admission and a death sentence. Rome had withdrawn, and the island was on its own. At first, life continued almost as before. Roman villas still stood amid tilled fields, and local leaders, Romanized Britons, with Latin names attempted to preserve order. They issued coins, governed markets, and repaired roads. But without imperial support, the framework of trade and taxation collapsed. The merchant ships that once sailed from Gaul and Spain dwindled, and the Roman currency that once bound Britain to the Mediterranean economy became meaningless. The cities, once proud symbols of Roman civility, grew quiet as workshops closed and public baths turned cold. By mid-century, Londinium was largely abandoned, its marble facades overtaken by weeds and silence. In the countryside, however, survival adapted. Small communities withdrew from the imperial economy and began to live more locally. Villas were divided among farming families. Roman tools were repurposed iron, smelted from old weapons, and pagan shrines quietly rededicated to older native gods. Archaeologists find this shift in the debris of daily life: simpler pottery, fewer imports, more handmade goods. It was not a sudden collapse, but a reversion to patterns that had existed long before empire. The veneer of Rome peeled away, revealing the Celtic and tribal heart of the islands beneath. Yet the vacuum of power did not remain empty. As Roman authority faded, new forces emerged, some from within, some from beyond the seas. To the north, Picts descended across the frontier. From the west came Irish raiders, and from the east, Germanic tribes began to land on the coasts of Kent and East Anglia. The Romano-British leaders, desperate for defense, reportedly invited Saxon mercenaries to serve as protectors. According to later chronicles, this decision proved disastrous. The Allies soon became invaders, carving out territories of their own and reshaping the linguistic and cultural landscape of Britain. The legends that would later feed medieval storytelling, Arthur among them, were born from this chaos. While historians debate the reality of any single leader uniting the Britons, the pattern of resistance is clear. Fragmented kingdoms rose from the ashes of the Roman towns, each ruled by warlords claiming descent from imperial or tribal bloodlines. Some maintained faint Roman customs, issuing decrees in Latin or preserving fragments of law. Others reverted entirely to Celtic traditions. The idea of Britannia dissolved into a patchwork of realms, each clinging to memory as if it were armor. Amid this fragmentation, the Church survived as one of the few institutions that bridged the old and new worlds. Christianity, already established in late Roman towns, retreated into monasteries and remote sanctuaries. These early monastic communities, isolated in Wales, Cornwall, and Western Britain, kept learning alive. They copied Latin texts, trained priests, and offered stability in an age when kings rose and fell like seasons. The foundations of medieval spirituality were laid here in modest stone chapels built from the ruins of Roman villas. Archaeological evidence from this era, often called sub-Roman Britain, paints a picture of resilience rather than ruin. Pottery continued to be made, hill forts reoccupied, and trade with the continent persisted in limited form. Excavations in Tintagel, for instance, have uncovered imported amphorae and fine glassware, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries, proof that elite households maintained contact with the Mediterranean world, even in the so-called Dark Ages. These connections suggest that fragments of the Romanized elite still held influence, perhaps serving as local kings who preserved aspects of the old order while negotiating new alliances. Still, isolation deepened. The once bustling roads grew over with grass, and forests reclaimed the land. Without central administration, literacy declined, and oral tradition reasserted its power. History began to dissolve into legend. Stories of giants building stone circles or of ancient heroes defending the realm took the place of Roman annals. For later medieval chroniclers, these centuries were a fog through which only myth could pass. Yet beneath the fog lay real people, farmers, warriors, monks, carrying forward the fragile memory of civilization. By the late 5th century, The island was a crossroads of survival and reinvention. The Roman infrastructure had decayed, but its shadow remained in the minds of the educated and in the physical landscape roads that still guided travelers' walls, that defined boundaries, Latin words, embedded in local dialects. Britain was no longer a province of an empire, but a collection of small worlds, each rooted in its own soil. Out of this fragmentation would rise the first outlines of medieval Britain, shaped not by Rome's grandeur, but by the persistence of those who refused to vanish. Historians often call the centuries after Rome's departure the Dark Ages, but darkness is merely the absence of familiar light. In Britain, that light was Latin bureaucracy, coinage, and written record. Once gone, what replaced it glowed differently, flickering through oral memory, local power, and the quiet endurance of communities. The Age of Shadows was not a time of emptiness, but of reorganization, when forgotten kings rose and vanished, and the foundations of medieval Britain took form beneath layers of chaos and myth. Across the island, life rearranged itself. The Roman roads still stretched between ruined towns, yet travelers now moved in smaller, wary groups. Fortified farmsteads and reoccupied hill forts became centers of survival. In Wales and Western England, native British leaders preserved remnants of Roman literacy, issuing charters and carving Latin crosses over older pagan stones. The sound of church bells mixed with the clang of forge hammers, a fragile coexistence of prayer and warfare. From the east, Germanic settlers arrived in growing numbers, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. What began as mercenary service soon evolved into settlement. Archaeological digs across Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia reveal rows of sunken huts, their hearths still blackened with soot, filled with pottery, distinct from the Roman styles that came before. Graves tell the rest of the story, warriors buried with spears, shields, and jewelry, in patterns drawn from continental designs. These newcomers brought their gods, Woden Thunor, and their tongues ancestral forms of what would one day become English. The Romano-British resistance held longest in the West. Figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, mentioned by later chroniclers, may represent real military leaders who rallied Celtic-speaking Britons against Saxon expansion. Their victories were brief but legendary. At Mount Badon, perhaps around 500 CE, British forces are said to have halted Saxon advances for a generation. This single event, half history, half myth, became a cornerstone of the later Arthurian cycle. To medieval writers, Arthur was not merely a king, but a symbol of lost unity, the shining phantom of an age that could have been. But unity was a dream rarely achieved. As Saxon settlement expanded inland, the British peoples retreated westward into the rugged lands of Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria, and across the Channel to Brittany, where they founded a new homeland. The island fractured into countless territories, each a small kingdom ruled by a lord whose power rested on sword and oath. Among the Britons, realms like Gwynedd Dyfed and Powys emerged. Among the newcomers, embryonic Saxon states began to take shape. Kent in the southeast, Sussex and Wessex, along the southern coasts, East Anglia and Mercia, further north. This patchwork world was fluid, violent, and astonishingly creative. Trade routes adapted to new realities, salt from the coasts, iron from the wheeled cattle, from the Welsh valleys. Monasteries became both spiritual and economic centers, producing manuscripts and goods that connected distant regions. Across the Irish Sea, the monasteries of Iona and Armagh flourished, sending missionaries and scholars who would one day re-Christianize the Saxon realms. In their illuminated manuscripts, bright pigments swirling on vellum, we see not decline, but renewal, the return of light through other hands. Language itself became a battlefield and a bridge. Latin lingered in church, and Low Celtic tongues thrived in the West, and Old English spread across the East. Place names still bear the scars of this linguistic collision. Avon from the Celtic Abona River, Chester from Latin castra fort, Ham and Tun from Old English for homestead and town. The landscape of medieval Britain became a palimpsest, each generation writing its claim over the traces of the last. What we call darkness may have felt to those living it like a return to intimacy, without imperial roads or distant governors. People lived within reach of their neighbors, bound by kinship and oath, rather than law and empire. A king's rule might extend no farther than a few days' march, but within that circle, loyalty ran deep. Feasting halls replaced senates, oral poetry replaced chronicles, and storytellers became keepers of history. The heroic lay and the elegy forms that would later echo in Beowulf arose from this time, preserving memory in rhythm and alliteration when writing could not. Archaeology reveals that even in this turbulence, beauty endured. Delicate brooches, sword pommels, inlaid with garnet and gold, and intricate weaving patterns suggest not a people adrift, but a culture rerouting itself. The Saxon cemeteries of Sutton Hoo and Prittlewell, centuries later, would confirm that these so-called barbarians possessed craftsmanship and vision to rival the empire they replaced. It was in these crucibles of adaptation that medieval Britain's character, its mixture of resilience, fatalism, and creative faith, was forged. By the 6th century, the island was divided among dozens of rulers, each fighting for legitimacy in a land haunted by ruins. Roman villas stood roofless beside Saxon halls. Forgotten bathhouses filled with weeds, while cattle grazed over the foundations of temples. Yet beneath that decay, something alive was forming. The interplay of old and new Celtic spirituality, Roman memory, and Germanic vigor was producing a hybrid civilization. The monks of Wales prayed in Latin beside hill forts once dedicated to pagan gods, while Saxon settlers held feasts where stories of Woden mixed with whispers of the Christ their grandchildren would one day worship. The Saxon shores glimmered under a cold northern light as new gods met the old ones in silence. When the Germanic settlers had first arrived, they came as hired swords, fleets of longboats, carrying warriors in search of land and spoils. By the 6th century, their descendants were building timber halls, burying their dead with weapons and amulets, and planting the seeds of kingdoms that would one day form the English nation. Across the east and south, the landscape of Roman villas and Celtic shrines gave way to wooden villages and open fields. Britain was no longer Roman nor wholly native, it was Anglo-Saxon now, though the soil still remembered older prayers. The Saxons were pragmatic conquerors. They named places by what they saw: Tun for a farmstead ham, for a home Ingus for the people of a clan. Over time, these suffixes stitched a new geography across the land, breeding Hastings, Birmingham living echoes of forgotten chieftains. Their gods shaped the days of the week, still spoken: Tuesday, Wharton's Day, Thuner's Day, and Frick's Day. A cosmology mapped into the rhythm of time itself. Their temples were made not of stone, but of timber, adorned with carved beasts and runic symbols. Fires burned before wooden idols, and sacrifices were offered to the unseen forces that ruled sky, sea, and harvest. And yet, even as pagan devotion thrived, Christianity, an ember from the dying Roman world, refused to fade. In the West, the old Romano-British churches survived their priests, teaching from crumbling Latin scrolls. In Ireland and Scotland, missionary monasticism was flourishing under figures like Columba, who founded Iona in 563 CE. From there, monks would sail to northern Britain, carrying not swords, but manuscripts, seeking to reclaim souls for the cross. At the same time, another current moved from the opposite shore, Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory in 597, landing in Kent to convert King Ethelbert and his people. The meeting of these two missions, Celtic and Roman, would define Britain's spiritual destiny. But before conversion could bind the island, kingdoms had to rise. The Heptarchy, as later chroniclers called it, began to take form, 7 major realms jostling for supremacy: Kent-Sussex, Essex-Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Each emerged from tribal confederations led by kings whose legitimacy came from ancestry, charisma, and victory in battle. These rulers built halls that were both court and sanctuary, filled with mead poetry and political intrigue. The Great Hall was the nucleus of Saxon life, a place of lawgiving and storytelling where loyalty was sealed by gift and oath. The archaeological record paints vivid scenes. Burial sites such as Sutton Hoo in East Anglia reveal a world of both ferocity and refinement ships, laden with weapons, gold and silver vessels. Garnet inlaid helmets gleaming beside lyres and drinking horns. The dead were not merely interred, they were launched into eternity as symbols of earthly grandeur and spiritual continuity. The Sutton Hoo burial, likely from the early 7th century, suggests a king steeped in both pagan and emerging Christian imagery. The ship as vessel to the afterlife, the cross as talisman, the sword as legacy. This synthesis mirrored the transitional soul of Britain itself. In daily life, the Saxons were farmers and craftsmen, shaping wood and metal with skill inherited from both native and continental traditions. Women wove intricate textiles and managed estates. Men hunted, farmed, and forged. Their language, Old English, absorbed traces of Latin and Celtic speech, becoming rich with compound words that captured their environment. Midgard for the human world beyond, for brightness, word for fate. Through these words, they wove a worldview where destiny was a living force and courage the highest virtue. The poetry that survives from this time, fragments like The Seafarer or The Wanderer, echoes with loneliness, exile, and the search for meaning in a transient world. Religion, too, was evolving in quiet contest. The missionaries from Rome brought organized hierarchy and Latin scripture. Those from Ireland brought mysticism and ascetic devotion. When Augustine established his seat in Canterbury, he built not only a church, but a bridge to memory, the first structured link between post-Roman Britain and continental Christendom. Still, his mission faced skepticism. Pagan rites were deeply rooted in community life, tied to the cycles of sowing and harvest. Conversion often meant negotiation. Sacred groves were rededicated rather than destroyed, festivals reinterpreted rather than banned. Over generations, the cross and the yoke stood side by side. In the north, the conversion took on its own rhythm. The kingdom of Northumbria, emerging from the fusion of Bernicia and Deira, became both a military and spiritual powerhouse. King Edwin's baptism in 627 marked a turning point, followed by the cultural flowering at Lindisfarne under Aidan. Their illuminated manuscripts were borne pages shimmering with gold, blue, and green, intertwining Celtic artistry with Christian text. The Lindisfarne Gospels embodied the soul of the New Britain, neither purely pagan nor purely Roman, but something altogether unique, where belief and art merged into meditation. Meanwhile, across the Midlands, Mercia rose under Benda, a formidable pagan king who resisted Christian dominance while building alliances through war and diplomacy. His reign, though violent, preserved a sense of autonomy that balanced the island's competing faiths. It would not be until his successors embraced Christianity that Mercia joined the common spiritual fold. By the 8th century, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was nearly complete in name. But beneath church towers, older spirits still lingered. Wells, trees, and stones retained whispers of pre-Christian reverence, remnants of an earth-centered piety that the new religion could not erase. The merging of Saxon shores and sacred stones was more than cultural coincidence. It was the slow fusion of worldviews. Pagan fatalism and Christian hope intertwined, creating a distinctive moral landscape. The warrior ethos softened into the ideal of the Christian knight. The feast transformed into the Eucharist. The sacred grove became the monastery garden. In these centuries of overlap, medieval Britain took root, a land neither wholly heathen nor wholly holy, but perpetually searching for balance between sky and soil sword, and scripture, old gods, and new grace. By the early 8th century, the island no longer belonged to tribes, but to kingdoms, and the landscape of early medieval Britain had hardened into a political chessboard of ambition and alliance. Chroniclers would later call this constellation of rival realms the Heptarchy, though the reality was less tidy, a swirling contest among Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, each rising and falling like tides. The dream of unity was far away, but in their competing courts, the fabric of English identity began to weave itself thread by thread. Northumbria, stretching from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, was the first to shine. Under kings like Edwin Oswald and Oswiu, it became both a sword and a sanctuary, a kingdom of saints and scholars as well as warriors. Monasteries at Lindisfarne, Weymouth, and Jarrow became islands of light in a restless sea. There, monks copied manuscripts, studied astronomy, and preserved fragments of classical knowledge nearly lost elsewhere in Europe. The Venerable Bede, writing in the early 700s, recorded the island's history in Latin, tracing a line of divine purpose from the Romans to the present. His ecclesiastical history of the English people did more than chronicle. It gave the English their first shared story. To the south, Mercia grew restless. Bordered by rivers and forests, it was both shielded and poised for conquest. Under King Offa, Mercia reached its zenith in the late 8th century, stretching influence from the Welsh border to East Anglia. Offa's most tangible legacy was the great earthwork known as Offa's Dyke, a massive embankment snaking across the borderlands, dividing Mercia from the Welsh kingdoms beyond. More than a fortification, it was a statement of identity. Here ended the English world, and beyond lay the unconquered. Offa also corresponded with Charlemagne minted coins bearing his name, and presided over a court that mirrored continental sophistication. Mercia's golden age glimmered briefly, but its shadow would linger in every later vision of kingship. Kent, once the first Saxon kingdom to accept Christianity, remained a hub of ecclesiastical authority. Canterbury flourished as the seat of the archbishop, linking England to Rome. Its scholars debated theology with Irish monks and continental envoys, blending Roman order with Celtic imagination. Across the Thames, Essex and Sussex retained smaller courts, each maintaining independence through diplomacy and occasional rebellion. East Anglia, rich in trade through its coastal ports, balanced pagan relics with Christian devotion, its royal family producing saints as readily as warriors. Meanwhile, in the southwest, Wessex was growing quietly. Its early kings, Cadwalla Ein and later Egbert, were pragmatic survivors, consolidating smaller territories and codifying laws that balanced Christian ethics with customary justice. Wessex's location, protected by hills and rivers, allowed it to strengthen while others exhausted themselves in war. Its people, hardy and literate, fostered a sense of continuity that would prove decisive when storms came from across the North Sea. Each kingdom had its poets, its saints, its rivalries. Alliances were sealed by marriage, broken by ambition. Kings feasted in timber halls beneath shields and antlers, boasting of ancestors who traced lineage to gods. Queens served not merely as consorts, but as patrons of churches and arbiters of peace. The conversion to Christianity had softened the public image of kingship, but not its ferocity. The sword was still divine instrument, and conquest still holy calling. Beneath the hymns, the drumbeat of vengeance and glory persisted. The economy, too, began to hum with new vigor. Trade routes extended from London's embryonic wharf to the Frankish coast, bringing glass silk and wine in exchange for wool and tin. Monasteries became centers of production, minting coins and copying charters, while craftsmen in burhs, the fortified towns that dotted the landscape, created goods for a growing market. The word England was not yet common, but the ingredients of an economy that could support a unified state were taking shape. Faith continued to mold identity. Synods convened to settle disputes between the Celtic and Roman traditions. The Synod of Whitby in 1664 marked a symbolic turning point. King Oswiu of Northumbria chose to align with Roman calculation of Easter rather than the Celtic system, binding the English Church more closely to continental Christendom. The decision had less to do with theology than with unity. One calendar meant one rhythm, one people under a common faith. It was a step toward the cultural cohesion that politics alone could not yet achieve. Beyond the official conversions, older traditions endured in shadow. Folk charms and rituals blended with Christian rites. Wells were blessed instead of abandoned harvest festivals, rebranded as saints' days, and runic amulets carved with crosses. This syncretism gave the faith in Britain its distinct texture, more grounded, more intimate, less rigid than Rome's. The English saints were often local heroes or martyrs, their relics enshrined in humble churches rather than gilded cathedrals. Theirs was a Christianity born of both humility and stubbornness, shaped by wind-rain and the rough humor of a people always on the edge of invasion. Yet that edge was closing in again. Across the northern seas, in the fjords of Norway and Denmark, another restless tide was gathering. Traders, explorers, and warriors began to look westward towards the fertile and divided island, whose monasteries glowed with gold and incense. By the late 8th century, their longships appeared on the eastern horizon, black silhouettes against the dawn. In 793, they descended on Lindisfarne, the holy island that had once symbolized the peace of conversion. The monks were slaughtered, the church looted, and the chronicles trembled with disbelief. The Viking Age had begun, and with it, the fragile world of the Heptarchy would be tested by fire and sea. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 shattered the illusion that Britain's newfound faith could shield it from the storms beyond its shores. The Northmen had come swift, ruthless, and insatiable. To the monks who recorded the event, it felt like divine punishment. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. One wrote, the heathen desecrated God's house. Yet what began as sporadic plunder soon evolved into a generation-spanning transformation. The arrival of the Vikings marked not only destruction, but renewal, a brutal crucible in which the island's fractured kingdoms would be reforged. Long before they earned their fearful reputation, the Norse were seafarers and traders. Their sleek longships, shallow-drafted and swift, could skim across open ocean and then glide up narrow rivers. They struck with the precision of a storm landing, at dawn plundering monasteries and vanishing by dusk. Wealth drew them first gold, silver, and slaves, but soon they saw something even more valuable: land. In Norway and Denmark, population pressures and internal feuds pushed younger warriors outward. The British Isles, fertile and divided, beckoned like an open promise. By the early 9th century, raids had turned to settlements. The Danes struck deep into the east, capturing York, then called Eoforic, and renaming it Jovik, their capital in England. The Norse established footholds in Ireland and the Isle of Man, while across Scotland, their influence reshaped coastal communities and language alike. Gaelic Norse and Pictish tongues intermingled. The very geography of Britain began to change. In the east, the Danelaw took form, a broad swath of territory governed under Scandinavian law and custom. Pagan temples rose again beside Christian churches, and the two worlds learned uneasily to coexist. For the monks and kings of the old Anglo-Saxon world, the Viking tempest was both nightmare and catalyst. The kingdoms that had once warred among themselves now faced a common threat. Mercia, weakened by internal strife, fell quickly under Danish dominance. East Anglia's king was martyred. Edmund, bound to a tree and shot with arrows, would later be canonized. Northumbria fractured into smaller earldoms, its monasteries plundered, its scholars scattered. Only Wessex held firm, shielded by geography, and a succession of determined rulers who refused to surrender. The conversion of the Northmen began almost as soon as they settled. The pragmatic Vikings were quick to adopt what worked: trade networks, local alliances, and eventually elements of Christianity. In some cases, baptism served as a diplomatic act, a way to cement peace or secure legitimacy. By the mid-9th century, entire Norse families were intermarrying with local elites, creating a hybrid aristocracy that blurred the lines between invader and native. The descendants of raiders became landlords, and Norse words quietly slipped into Old English sky law, window husband echoes of coexistence carved into the language itself. In art and craftsmanship, the blending was even more visible. Grave goods from the Danelaw reveal crosses inscribed with runic motifs, swords with hilts shaped like serpents from Norse myth, and jewelry intertwining dragons with Christian iconography. The pagan dragon, long a symbol of chaos, was reimagined in Christian legend as the foe of saints, proof that cultural exchange was a two-way street. The very same image that had terrified early chroniclers now adorned their churches as a metaphor for faith's triumph over fate. Still, the conversion was far from complete. Many Norse settlers continued to honor Odin and Thor in private, even as they outwardly adopted Christian rites. saga traditions hint that old sacrifices persisted in secret groves long after baptismal fonts were installed. This duality gave the Danelaw a distinct identity, neither wholly pagan nor Christian, neither foreign nor native. It was a frontier of belief, as much as of territory, where the past and future of Britain overlapped. The political map shifted once again. In 865, the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Danish warbands, landed in East Anglia and swept through the island with methodical devastation. Within a decade, nearly every Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen or submitted. The chronicles read, like laments, abbeys, burned kings, slain relics, lost. Yet even amid ruin, a flicker of resistance endured in Wessex under the leadership of Alfred, son of Ethelwulf. When the Viking storm reached his borders, it met an enemy unlike the others, one who combined faith with strategy, humility with vision. The conflict between Alfred and the Danes would define the next chapter of Britain's destiny. But in these earlier decades, the transformation was already underway. The Viking Age introduced not just fear, but mobility, a reopening of seas and horizons that had closed since Rome's fall. Trade routes revived, silver from the east flowed into English markets, and artisans from Frisia and Scandinavia enriched local craftsmanship. Even the church, though, wounded adapted, producing saints and scholars who sought not vengeance but reconciliation. The meeting of pagan and Christian worlds created a Britain that was paradoxically more cosmopolitan than ever before. The old divisions of the Heptarchy began to blur as cultural synthesis replaced conquest. The Viking tempest had redrawn boundaries, but it had also forced unity of purpose. Out of the ashes of monasteries rose fortified burhs, schools, and new centers of power that would one day define a single kingdom. The island's identity, long fragmented, was hardening again, this time in resistance renewal, and a deeper understanding of its own resilience. By the time peace treaties began to formalize borders between the Danelaw and Wessex, Britain was no longer the same. The language had changed, the art had evolved, and the spirit of the people had adapted once again to survive. Pagan and Christian Saxon, and Norse native and foreign, all had blended into a tapestry that would later define medieval England. Out of violence came a strange kind of unity, and from that unity, the faint heartbeat of a nation began to sound beneath the smoke of its own rebirth. While the Viking tide reshaped England's east, the western fringes of Britain held fast to older rhythms. The mountains of Wales, the moors of Cornwall, the glens of Scotland, and the green valleys of Ireland became sanctuaries for languages, customs, and mythologies that predated both Saxon and Norse. The Celtic fringe endured not merely as relic, but as living resistance, a cultural heartbeat that refused to be drowned by conquest. Here, the ancestral patterns of kinship poetry and faith wove a continuity that would outlast empires. In Wales, the Brittonic-speaking kingdoms of Gwynedd Powys and Dyfed maintained their independence through sheer geography and pride. Stone fortresses crowned hilltops, and lineage mattered as much as law. The Cyfraith Hywel, or Law of Hywel Dea Daota, codified in the 10th century, preserved ancient custom while integrating Christian morality. It treated women's rights, inheritance, and social duty with a pragmatism rare in the wider medieval world. The Welsh bards, heirs of Druidic tradition, carried the collective memory of their people through verse. Their poems, half lament, half prophecy, celebrated fallen heroes and warned of betrayal. Even as Saxon kings expanded eastward, the Welsh sang of themselves as the true inheritors of ancient Britain, Cornwall followed a similar path. Cut off by rugged terrain and sea, it remained a land of mixed pagan-Christian devotion well into the Middle Ages. Its saints, like Petroc and Piran, often had one foot in Celtic myth and another in monastic legend. Small stone chapels, perched on cliffs, where once had stood shrines to forgotten deities of sea and storm. The Cornish tongue cousin to Welsh and Breton preserved echoes of ancient speech long after English dominated elsewhere. In their fishing villages and tin mines, the people lived within sight of the Saxon frontier, but with hearts turned towards the Western Ocean. Across that ocean lay Ireland, whose monastic network had by this time become one of Europe's great centers of learning. When the rest of the continent reeled under raids and chaos, Irish monasteries thrived as sanctuaries of scholarship. Monks illuminated manuscripts with breathtaking artistry spirals, beasts and sacred texts merging into shimmering labyrinths of faith. The Book of Kells, created around the early 9th century, epitomized this fusion of devotion and design. The Irish Church, decentralized and ascetic, radiated influence outward to Iona to Lindisfarne, and even back to the continent through missions in Gaul and Germany. Its blend of mysticism and discipline helped preserve learning through centuries of turmoil. Scotland, meanwhile, was a realm in transformation. The Picts, the mysterious painted tribes of the north, gradually merged with Gaelic settlers from Ireland, forming the Kingdom of Alba. By the 9th century, figures like Kenneth MacAlpin began to unite disparate regions under one crown. The new Scottish identity drew from both Celtic and Norse heritage, especially along the coasts, where Viking jarls ruled over mixed populations. The Norse presence, though violent in its arrival, left behind artistry and language that enriched the native culture. Gaelic would remain dominant in the Highlands, but Norse runes would still mark stones in Orkney and the Hebrides for centuries. The endurance of these Celtic fringes mattered deeply to Britain's later identity. They preserved oral traditions that the Latinized South had lost. When medieval chroniclers sought to fill the gaps of early history, they turned to Welsh and Irish tales, legends of Bran, of Lud, of Arthur, and Merlin. The great cycle of Arthurian romance, so central to later English literature, was rooted not in Saxon lore, but in Celtic myth. In those western mountains, stories of enchanted lakes, prophetic dreams, and battles against monstrous invaders were told around firelight long before French poets reworked them into chivalric epics. The medieval imagination owed its heartbeat to those who had resisted assimilation. Even within the spread of Christianity, the Celtic regions kept their independence of spirit. Their monasteries were less hierarchical, their saints more human, their miracles closer to the soil. Holy wells replaced pagan springs. Pilgrimages followed paths that had once been druidic processions. The faith that grew there was intimate and local, steeped in nature and poetry. Stone crosses carved with interlace and beasts still dot the Welsh and Cornish landscape monuments, not of triumph, but of harmony between faiths. Politically, however, isolation could not last forever. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated under Alfred and his successors, the Western realms faced increasing pressure. Tribute raids and diplomacy became the tools of survival. Yet even under external domination, cultural autonomy persisted. The Welsh princes negotiated with English kings on near equal terms, and the High Kings of Ireland maintained ritual gatherings at Tara long after foreign courts dictated law elsewhere. In Scotland, a blend of Gaelic and Norse blood forged a kingdom capable of standing beside England, not beneath it. The persistence of Celtic identity gave medieval Britain a layered soul. The English language would later borrow hundreds of place names from Welsh and Cornish. The church calendar would adopt saints of Irish origin, and the poetic sensibility that prized nature, lament, and the supernatural would pass into the English canon. Beneath the Latin charters and Norman architecture, the Celtic heartbeat continued to sound. It spoke of endurance of memory as resistance, and of a vision of land not as possession, but as inheritance shared between living and dead. As the 10th century dawned, the island's many voices, Saxon, Norse, and Celtic, formed a rough chorus. Their rivalries were fierce, their alliances fragile, but the old tribal lines were softening. Out of the western hills, the ancient songs drifted eastward, again carried by monks, poets, and pilgrims. The Celtic fringe, though often dismissed as peripheral, was in truth the wellspring of Britain's imagination. It had endured conquest after conquest, and in doing so, it had ensured that the story of medieval Britain would never be one of erasure, but of survival through transformation. By the time the first frost of the 9th century settled across the island, the Norse presence had ceased to be a passing storm and become a constant season. The Viking tempest was no longer an invasion, but a fact of life. From the shores of Yorkshire to the rivers of East Anglia, from the Scottish Isles to the Irish Sea, the Northmen had embedded themselves into the landscape. Britain had become an island of dual horizons, one Latin and Christian, the other Norse and seafaring. Out of their collision rose a culture both hardened and renewed. The Danelaw, stretching from the Thames to the Humber and beyond, became the great frontier of this new world. It was not merely a political line, but a cultural one, marked by differences in law, language, and custom. Norse rule emphasized personal honor and community assemblies, the thing where free men debated disputes and reached decisions by consent. The Anglo-Saxons, though accustomed to kings and councils, found themselves absorbing these northern habits. Place names across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite, still whisper of those meetings and settlements. Every village name was a trace of coexistence. The blending of laws produced practical compromise. The Danelaga operated under the laws of the Danes, while Wessex and Mercia kept their Anglo-Saxon codes. Merchants, farmers, and clergy adapted accordingly. Gold was measured in orland, in plowshares, and justice in vergild. The price of a man's life calculated by rank and status. For all their rough reputation, the Norse valued law deeply. Their assemblies were the seeds of later parliaments. Even the word law itself is Scandinavian in origin, absorbed permanently into English speech. Yet beneath this uneasy peace, conflict simmered. The great heathen army's conquests had left the English heartland in ruins, and the Christian church struggled to reassert itself. Monasteries that once glowed with scholarship stood roofless, their relics scattered. The clergy fled south to the protection of Wessex, where Alfred the Great was preparing the most improbable counterattack in Britain's early medieval story. While the Danes ruled the east, Alfred's small kingdom became a refuge for everything the island feared, losing language learning and faith. The Viking presence forced adaptation in every sphere. In warfare, the English learned to fight like their invaders, swift, mobile, and strategic. Alfred built a network of fortified towns, or burhs, each positioned within a day's march of the next. These became both military bastions and market symbols of resilience and urban rebirth. In time, many would evolve into cities, Winchester, Oxford, and Exeter among them. The English Navy, too, was reborn under Alfred's vision, its ships modelled on Norse designs, but larger and sturdier. From the ashes of plundered monasteries rose the infrastructure of a kingdom. Religion, too, transformed under pressure. The church began to speak with a broader, more pragmatic voice. Pagan converts were not purged, but integrated their customs, reinterpreted as symbols of Christian truth. The Norse reverence for fate and courage found echoes in Christian sermons that praised steadfastness under trial. Saints replaced heroes, yet the tone of the sagas lingered in homilies. When King Guthrum of the Danes accepted baptism after defeat by Alfred at Edington in 878, it was not merely a peace treaty, but a ritual of synthesis. Pagan warriors entered the Christian fold without surrendering their dignity. Culturally, the Viking Age gave Britain an unexpected vitality. Trade expanded dramatically, silver from Arabia glass, from the Rhineland silk, from Byzantium, all flowed through the Danelaw ports. York, once a Roman colony, and later a Saxon stronghold, became Jorvik, a bustling hub of artisans and merchants. Excavations there have revealed combs, jewelry, gaming pieces, and leather shoes of fine craftsmanship, objects that tell of comfort, creativity, and commerce, not mere barbarism. The Northmen brought shipwright skills, open trade, and a sense of worldly connection that would shape Britain's later maritime destiny. Even art carried their mark. Stone crosses carved in the north display, intertwining serpents, and vine motifs, the Christian cross wrapped in pagan energy. Brooches and pendants bear Odin's ravens alongside Christ's monogram. This coexistence of symbols reflected the reality of daily life, where faith and folklore mingled seamlessly. The Norse love of storytelling also infused Anglo-Saxon poetry with new vigor. Tales of dragons' destiny and doomed heroes, long a Norse specialty, found their English counterparts in Beowulf, whose fusion of Germanic legend and Christian reflection perfectly embodied the age's spirit. Across the seas, the Viking world was itself changing. Scandinavian kings, enriched by conquest, began to centralize power, and the pagan homeland slowly opened to Christian missionaries. The same forces that had torn Britain apart were now reshaping the North. Britain was both victim and teacher in this transformation. The raids that had once plundered its monasteries now inspired the Norse to build their own churches and towns. The island had become a mirror in which the northern world saw its future. For ordinary people, the 9th and 10th centuries were not merely eras of kings and raids, but of survival and adaptation. Farmers tilled fields that had once been battlegrounds, forging communities where English and Norse children grew up side by side. Their languages blended at the hearth, giving birth to a simpler, more flexible English that would eventually replace Latin as the tongue of chronicles and law. The mixing of blood and speech created a foundation of shared resilience. By the end of the 10th century, the Viking tempest had calmed into a steady wind of influence. The Danes were no longer strangers, but part of the island's story. Their ships had brought terror, but also trade. Their gods had challenged the cross, yet yielded to it without disappearing completely. The Danelaw would eventually be absorbed, but its memory remained etched in names, customs, and laws. The storm had passed, but it had left the soil richer. What emerged from this crucible was not a return to the old order, but the preparation for something new, a unified kingdom forged through adversity. The line between Saxon and Dane pagan and Christian native and foreign had blurred. The island was ready, though it did not yet know it, for the dream of Alfred's heirs, a single England tempered by centuries of division and born from the mingled ashes of conquest and faith. When Alfred ascended the throne of Wessex in 871, he inherited not a kingdom, but a desperate remnant of a nation. The Viking onslaught had shattered every neighboring realm. Mercia was broken, Northumbria divided, and East Anglia consumed. Only Wessex endured, hemmed in by enemies and burdened by refugees. Alfred was barely in his 20s, ill from chronic ailments that would follow him throughout life. Yet from this precarious beginning, he forged a vision greater than mere survival. His dream of unity would echo long after his death, an idea not of conquest, but of coherence, a realm bound by learning, law, and faith. In the early years of his reign, Alfred's rule was a struggle against extinction. The great heathen army, led by the Danish warlord Guthrum, drove him into the marshes of Somerset. From a small island stronghold at Athelney, he waged guerrilla war, rallying scattered forces and rebuilding hope. It was during this exile that legend says he burned the peasant woman's cakes, an image that endures not because of domestic failure, but because it captures his humanity. A king brought low, tending his own food, while planning a nation's salvation. When he finally emerged, it was not as a fugitive, but as a symbol of endurance. In 878, Alfred met Guthrum at Edington in one of the decisive battles of early medieval history. Against the odds, the Saxon army triumphed. Guthrum's defeat was not followed by massacre, but by mercy. Alfred invited the Danish leader to baptism, standing as his godfather, a gesture that turned war into negotiation. The Treaty of Wedmore divided England into two spheres, Wessex and its allies in the south, the Danelaw in the north and east. For the first time, the boundaries of future England took tangible form. It was not unity yet, but it was a beginning. Alfred's genius extended beyond the battlefield. He understood that strength could not rest on arms alone. To rebuild his realm, he revived learning, inviting scholars from across Europe to his court. Monks from Mercia, clerics from Francia, even Irish scholars found refuge in Winchester. Latin texts were translated into Old English so that his people might understand the wisdom of the past. Alfred himself helped translate works like Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, inserting his own reflections on kingship and morality. Through education, he sought to knit faith and governance into a single moral fabric. His reforms touched every aspect of life. He standardized law, blending Mosaic principles, Christian ethics, and native custom into what became known as Alfred's Dooms. These codes did not invent justice, but clarified it, anchoring divine order within daily life. His Burr's system fortified the landscape with secure towns, providing defense, trade, and administration. Each free man owed service to a burr, linking military duty with civic responsibility. It was an early form of citizenship, long before the word existed. The navy, once a feeble flotilla, became a formidable deterrent. Alfred's shipwrights designed vessels longer and higher than the Viking longships, capable of both river and open sea battle. The result was not instant dominance, but gradual deterrence. The Danes could no longer raid with impunity. The coasts of Wessex became a guarded frontier, and for the first time in a century, stability returned. Spiritually, Alfred was deeply devout, yet his faith was tempered by reason. He saw himself as a shepherd, rather than a conqueror, a ruler accountable before God for the welfare of his people. His court combined austerity with intellect, where psalms were sung beside debates on philosophy and law. Chroniclers would later call him England's darling, not for his victories alone, but for his vision of governance as moral duty. He embodied a rare medieval ideal, the philosopher king, who saw education as the defense of the soul. His successors inherited not merely his throne, but his blueprint. His son, Edward the Elder, and daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, continued the fight to reclaim the Danelaw. Ethelfled, ruling from Worcester, commanded armies, built fortresses, and negotiated alliances with shrewdness equal to any king. Her victories in Chester and Derby paved the way for the reconquest of the north. Under their combined rule, the patchwork of Saxon and Danish lands began to knit together into something resembling a unified England. Culturally, Alfred's reign marked a quiet renaissance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle began under his patronage, the first sustained historical record in the vernacular. It preserved not only battles and kings, but the rhythm of ordinary years, floods, eclipses, famines, and births. The very act of recording events in English gave the people a shared narrative, something Rome had never granted them. It was as if language itself became a fortress, defending memory against oblivion. Even the church was reshaped. Monasteries were rebuilt, clergy re-educated, and parishes reorganized. Alfred sought not the wealth of the church, but its wisdom, insisting that ignorance among priests was as dangerous as swords among thieves. His revival of literacy and moral teaching rekindled the intellectual light of the island. The scriptoria of Wessex began producing manuscripts that blended Christian devotion with distinctly English artistry. Interlaced borders, golden initials, and marginal beasts that echoed Celtic predecessors. By the time of Alfred's death in 899, the transformation was visible. Wessex was no longer a besieged refuge, but the nucleus of a kingdom. The Danelaw persisted, but its edges softened under diplomacy and marriage. Trade flowed freely between English and Norse towns. Coinage bore the king's image on one side and the cross on the other. The idea of Englishness had moved from abstraction to aspiration. Alfred's dream of unity was not realized in his lifetime, yet he had given the island its moral compass. He showed that learning could be as powerful as steel, that peace required preparation, and that faith without wisdom was as fragile as parchment in the rain. His legacy outlasted dynasties, wars, and even languages. When later kings called themselves Rex Anglorum, kings of the English, they were invoking not empire, but Alfred's quiet, persistent vision that from scattered tribes and shattered monasteries, a single people might rise, who could remember both their suffering and their grace. When Alfred's crown passed to his heirs, the fragile unity he had envisioned began to take shape in earnest. His son, Edward the Elder, and his formidable daughter, Ethelfled of Mercia, carried forward his legacy with steel and strategy. They expanded the network of burhs, reclaiming territory piece by piece from the Danelaw. By the 920s, English control stretched farther north than any king had dared since Rome's withdrawal. In their generation, the dream of a single England no longer seemed impossible. It had simply to survive long enough to be born. After Edward and Ethelfled, the crown passed to their descendants, culminating in the reign of Ethelstan, often called the first true King of England. His rule from 924 to 939 marked the moment when the island's scattered threads, Saxon Mercian, Danish, and Celtic, were briefly woven together. Athelstan was not merely a conqueror. He was a legislator and diplomat, fluent in Latin and steeped in scripture. His court at Winchester hosted poets and scholars from across Europe. He issued coins bearing the title Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, and for a fleeting generation, the claim was not mere vanity. He defeated the Norse and Scots at Brunanburh in 937, a battle immortalized in verse as the great victory that saved the English race. The triumph, however, was fragile. After Athelstan's death, succession disputes and renewed Viking incursions tested the kingdom's foundations. Under his successors, Edmund Edred and Edgar, the realm expanded and contracted like a lung under strain. Yet during Edgar's reign in the later 10th century, the kingdom enjoyed rare stability. Known as Edgar the Peaceful, he ruled not through conquest, but consolidation. His coronation at Bath in 973, accompanied by bishops and nobles from all corners of the land, symbolized unity at last. He codified naval defense, standardized coinage, and invited Welsh and Scottish kings to acknowledge him as overlord in a ceremonial act of homage. It was diplomacy through grandeur, a vision of kingship that fused Alfred's moral order with imperial ambition. Beneath the surface, old fissures remained. The Danelaw's towns still spoke dialects, touched by Norse and local loyalties, often outweighed allegiance to the distant crown. Yet in these very differences lay England's resilience. The diversity of its origins, the blending of pagan courage, Christian piety, and practical governance had created a people uniquely adaptable. The monastic reform movement of the 10th century reflected that same blend of idealism and pragmatism. Leaders like Dunstan Ethelwald and Oswald restored monasteries, promoted learning, and reimposed discipline on a clergy grown lax. Their efforts produced a new generation of illuminated manuscripts and choral liturgies that rivaled continental artistry. The abbeys of Glastonbury, Winchester, and Ramsey became sanctuaries of order amid political noise. The Northmen were not finished with England. Across the sea, new powers had risen in Denmark, under kings like Svein Forkbeard and his son Knut, who sought to bind Scandinavia and Britain into a single northern empire. Beginning in the late 10th century, fresh Viking fleets raided the coasts and towns that had known peace for half a century, once again tasted smoke and blood. The chroniclers wrote with weary fatalism, "The heathen came again, and the people paid tribute." The Danegeld, a tax levied to buy peace, became a symbol of both England's wealth and its vulnerability. Amid this turbulence stood Ethelred, later called the Unready, a title that in Old English meant unread, ill-advised, rather than unprepared. His reign from 978 to 1016 was a study in contradiction. Intelligent and devout, he nevertheless governed through indecision and mistrust. Betrayals at court, conflicting counsel, and repeated invasions eroded royal authority. In 1002, Ethelred ordered the massacre of Danes living in England, a desperate act that backfired disastrously. Among the slain may have been relatives of Svein Forkbeard himself, who responded with a full-scale invasion. By 1013, the Danish king had conquered most of England, and Ethelred fled to Normandy, seeking refuge among his wife's kin, the dukes whose descendants would one day change England forever. Swein's reign was short. He died in 1014, and Ethelred briefly returned. But the struggle for the crown continued between his heirs and Swein's son, Knut. When the dust settled in 1016, Knut stood victorious, uniting England, Denmark, and Norway under one crown. far from being a foreign despot, Cnut proved a capable and pragmatic ruler. He maintained English laws, respected the church, and even married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, blending dynasties once at war. His reign brought a decade of peace, and under his patronage, England re-entered the European stage as a stable and respected realm. Cnut's empire, though grand, was fleeting. After his death in 1035, his son's rivalries shattered the union, and the old West Saxon line returned in the person of Edward the Confessor. Pious, contemplative, and detached from worldly ambition, Edward's reign restored native kingship but reintroduced foreign influence through his Norman court. He built Westminster Abbey, a symbol of heavenly devotion and royal authority combined. Yet his failure to produce an heir set the stage for the next great rupture in Britain's story. As Edward's health declined in 1065, rival claims to the throne loomed. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, stood as England's native champion. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy, claiming kinship and a broken promise, prepared an invasion. And in the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway saw a chance to revive the Viking dream. The stage was set for a reckoning that would end one age and begin another. In 1066, the winds of destiny shifted once more. The battle that followed Hastings would not only decide a crown, but redefine what it meant to be English. The Norman arrival was the last great conquest of medieval Britain, sealing centuries of migration war and cultural fusion into a single, irreversible transformation. Alfred's dream of unity had survived, but it was about to wear a new face, one forged in both sword and script, faith and fire, Saxon and Norman alike. The Norman arrival in 1066 was not a storm that passed. It was a tectonic shift. When Duke William's fleet crossed the Channel, it carried not only knights and archers, but an entire continental system of governance, language, and hierarchy. The Saxon and Danish age ended on the field at Hastings, when Harold Godwinson fell beneath a hail of arrows and mounted charge. With that single day's outcome, England's 1,000 years of isolation ended. What followed was neither annihilation nor simple conquest, but fusion, brutal, transformative, and enduring. William's coronation in Westminster on Christmas Day sealed the legitimacy of his claim, yet the peace that followed was uneasy. Norman lords spread across the land like wildfire, seizing estates, building castles, and replacing English earls with continental vassals. The feudal system so long entrenched in France took firm root in England, binding every man to another by oath. Castles of stone and timber rose over old Saxon towns, mortar and bailey strongholds, such as Rochester, Durham, and Warwick, became symbols of domination. The English countryside, once marked by open halls and wooden churches, bristled with towers that cast long shadows of authority. The language of power changed as swiftly as its architecture. Norman French became the speech of court law and nobility. Latin remained the tongue of church and record. Old English survived among commoners, its rhythms softening and absorbing new vocabulary. Out of this linguistic collision would emerge Middle English, a hybrid tongue, flexible and rich, that centuries later would give voice to Chaucer. But in the first decades after conquest, the divide was deep. An English peasant could not plead in his own language. His future was decided in words he barely understood. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1085, captured the new order with chilling precision. Every acre, ox, and villager was recorded, turning land itself into an instrument of control. It was both a census and a statement of ownership. England was no longer a patchwork of local loyalties, but a single estate held under the crown. Yet within that act of domination lay the seeds of an enduring national consciousness. For the first time, all of England was counted, mapped, and named as one. Resistance was inevitable. Rebellions flared across the north and west, where Saxon nobles and Danish settlers still clung to autonomy. William's response, the harrying of the north, was ruthless. Villages burned, fields, salted populations scattered. The scars of that campaign lingered for generations. Chronicles speak of waste and death from York to Durham. Yet even in devastation, the land adapted. Norman monasteries rose on ruins, and new towns grew around castle walls. Trade routes shifted toward continental ports, binding England to Normandy, Flanders, and beyond. The kingdom was no longer peripheral to Europe, it was its new frontier. The church, too, was remade. William replaced English bishops with Norman clergymen loyal to him as both spiritual and temporal lord. Canterbury, once the heart of Alfred's faith, became the seat of continental reform. Cathedrals of stone Durham. Ely Winchester rose in the new Romanesque style, vast and symmetrical, designed to awe both believer and subject. Yet beneath the imported grandeur, Old English spirituality persisted. The cults of native saints, Cuthbert Edmund, Edward the Confessor, continued to draw pilgrims. The conquerors had taken the land, but not the soul. William's successors continued to balance brutality with administration. His son, William Rufus, ruled with energy but little restraint, clashing with the church and dying mysteriously in the New Forest, an accident some whispered was divine justice. Henry I, more cautious, issued the Charter of Liberties, an early attempt to bind royal power with law. In time, these charters would evolve into the Magna Carta, a testament that even kings must answer to justice. The paradox of Norman rule was thus born. Conquest imposed hierarchy, yet hierarchy demanded accountability. The very efficiency of feudal order created tools that later generations would use to challenge tyranny. In the broader fabric of Britain, the Norman impact rippled outward. In Wales and Scotland, marcher lords built castles and pressed borders, while Ireland would soon face invasion from Anglo-Norman adventurers. The British Isles were becoming a web of dynastic entanglements, each tied to the fortunes of Normandy and France. The Plantagenet dynasty, descending from the Norman line, would later inherit not just England, but vast territories across the Channel, turning kings into continental powers and England itself into a player in European politics. Culturally, the Norman period brought refinement and expansion. Architecture soared, literacy widened among the elite, and art once insular now reflected continental motifs. The tapestry of Bayeux, though made in Normandy, told the story of England's conquest in thread and color, a narrative both triumphal and mournful. It is not English history as the vanquished would have written it, yet its very survival proves how deeply the two cultures had intertwined. In the cloisters and scriptoria of Norman abbeys, English monks illuminated manuscripts in Latin, embedding local saints into continental hagiographies. The conqueror's pen in time became the island's mirror. Amid all the splendor and reconstruction, the memory of the old kings persisted. The songs of Alfred, the valor of Ethelstan, the justice of Edgar, all lived in the whispers of common folk and the prayers of monasteries. For the first generation of conquered English, The past was not nostalgia, but protest, a reminder that the land beneath the castles had once been free. Slowly, however, the boundaries between Norman and English blurred. By the 12th century, intermarriage, shared war, and faith had produced a new aristocracy, a class that spoke French but thought increasingly of England as home. The forgotten kings and queens who reigned during this transition were the bridge between worlds. Some ruled briefly, others barely ruled at all, yet each carried the story forward. From the ashes of conquest rose a hybrid realm part, Latin part, Saxon part, Norse, a crucible from which the medieval identity of Britain would emerge. By the century's end, the Normans no longer called themselves foreigners, and the English no longer saw themselves as conquered. The island had endured, transformed, yet intact, ready for the next stage of faith, plague, and reformation that would again test its foundations. By the 12th century, England was no longer a conquered province, but the heart of a rising dynasty whose reach spanned oceans and faiths. Yet beneath the banners of kings and cathedrals of stone, another transformation was unfolding, the reshaping of memory itself. The chroniclers, monks, and storytellers of medieval Britain began to write their world into permanence. In their hands, history became legend, and legend became the moral fabric of identity. The medieval mind sought not mere record, but meaning, turning the chaos of conquest into divine narrative. The scribes of abbeys like Canterbury, Durham, and Glastonbury worked by candlelight, copying not just scripture, but stories. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, once the plain record of kings, gave way to chronicles that blended fact with prophecy. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 1130s, composed Historia Regum Britannia, a sweeping tale that traced the island's origins to Brutus of Troy, and wove the first coherent account of King Arthur. It was myth presented as lineage, a genealogy that reached from Rome's fall to the Norman throne. To the medieval imagination, such stories were not falsehoods, but vessels of truth, explaining through allegory what history alone could not contain. Arthur's return in these texts was no accident. For a people long conquered, first by Rome, then by Saxons, then by Normans, his legend offered a vision of unity and justice that transcended time. The Welsh saw in him their lost sovereignty, the English their ancestral virtue, and the Normans their legitimizing myth. By claiming Arthur, all could claim continuity. The legend's power lay in its adaptability. He was at once a Celtic hero, a Christian king, and a knightly ideal. From Geoffrey's Latin prose would spring centuries of retelling, from Chrétien de Troyes' romances in France to Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in 15th century England, each layer transforming ancient echoes into moral parable. Monastic historians shaped memory with equal purpose. William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon, and Orderic Vitalis combined classical learning with biblical interpretation. Their chronicles framed English history as providential, a divine plan unfolding through suffering and renewal. The invasions of Romans, Danes, and Normans were reimagined as trials of faith rather than accidents of power. Such thinking soothed a society built upon conquest. It allowed victors and vanquished alike to see themselves as instruments of destiny. The past became not a wound, but a staircase leading towards salvation. Language mirrored this synthesis. Old English faded, but its cadences endured within the new Middle English tongue, earthy, direct, and musical. French words lent grace to law and courtly love. Latin supplied structure and theology. From their mingling arose the expressive vocabulary that would later cradle Chaucer's poetry. The same process unfolded in architecture. The Romanesque solidity of early Norman cathedrals softened into the soaring verticality of Gothic design. Arches stretched heavenward as if the stones themselves sought absolution for the violence that had placed them there. Amid these cultural convergences, England's rulers evolved from conquerors into administrators. Henry II, grandson of the conqueror, embodied the new medieval monarchy, restless, brilliant, and relentless in law. His legal reforms created the framework of common law and the system of royal justice that endures today. Yet his reign also birthed tragedy, the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170, a martyrdom that exposed the uneasy balance between crown and church. Pilgrims soon flocked to Canterbury to venerate Becket's shrine, their footsteps forming paths that still crisscross the English countryside. Faith and dissent, once enemies, had become twin pillars of national conscience. While chroniclers wrote of kings and saints, ordinary life took quieter but no less profound turns. Markets expanded, towns gained charters, and guilds emerged to regulate trade. Literacy spread beyond monasteries into merchant households. Parchment and ink became tools of daily transaction. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge, founded in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, institutionalized learning that had once depended on cloisters. The intellectual seed Alfred had planted centuries earlier now blossomed into Europe's first truly English centers of study. Yet even as knowledge advanced, the memory of ancient times persisted in rural superstition and folklore. Farmers still left offerings at wells. Shepherds whispered charms against illness. The names of pagan gods lingered in place names and proverbs. The church often tolerated these remnants, seeing in them not rebellion, but continuity. Every parish had its saint, every village its legend, and together they formed a tapestry of belief more intricate than any theologian's creed. The storytellers who wandered from hall to hall, the minstrels and poets carried these threads forward. They recited not annals, but emotions, love and betrayal, exile and belonging. Their verses bridged the gap between the Latin of the monastery and the speech of the market. In their songs, the ghosts of Celtic bards met the rhythm of Saxon elegy and the gallantry of Norman chivalry. The resulting tone, melancholy yet resolute, became the hallmark of Britain's imagination. By the 13th century, memory itself had become a form of power. Kings commissioned chronicles to justify claims. Abbeys compiled genealogies to defend land. Families preserved ancestry as proof of divine favor. Yet through all the calculation, something genuine endured: the conviction that history was not dead parchment, but living inheritance. To forget was to lose one's place in the divine order. Thus, the monks and poets of medieval Britain kept writing, illuminating, and reciting, each convinced that the act of remembering was itself an offering to God. Through their work, the islands tangled past Celtic and Saxon, Norse and Norman was distilled into narrative coherence. What had once been chaos became continuity. What had been conquest became providence. The chroniclers did not merely record Britain's history, they created it. Their quills turned battlefields into moral lessons, ruins into relics, and kings into symbols. Out of parchment and ink, they gave birth to a shared imagination, one that would outlive every dynasty they served. By the late Middle Ages, The patchwork of people's faiths and tongues that had once struggled for dominance had fused into something unmistakably British. The echoes of Rome, the murmur of the Saxons, the sagas of the Northmen, and the songs of the Celts all coexisted in a landscape dense with memory. Cathedrals rose where pagan groves had stood. Manor houses incorporated Roman stones, and beneath the rhythms of English speech lingered the cadences of Welsh hills and Norse fjords. The forgotten origins of medieval Britain had not vanished. They had ripened buried in plain sight, beneath every prayer law and song. The 14th century brought both splendor and crisis. The flowering of Gothic architecture and the birth of English literature unfolded alongside famine, rebellion, and plague. The Black Death, arriving in 1348, decimated nearly half the population. Yet even in devastation, the society that endured was changed rather than destroyed. Laborers demanded wages, peasants petitioned for rights, and the rigid hierarchies of feudal life began to tremble. Out of grief grew an unexpected equality. Every tomb, no matter how grand, bore the same Latin epitaph, memento mori, remember you must die. The medieval mind, long shaped by divine order, now wrestled with human fragility. Language, once divided by class, began to unify the realm. The Norman nobles' French softened into an English enriched by centuries of mingling. When Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in the late 1300s, he drew from the full palette of that hybrid tongue, courtly grace, peasant humor, clerical irony. His pilgrims, speaking in accents from every corner of the island, embodied a nation rediscovering its voice. Through him, English ceased to be the language of subjugation and became a language of art. The path from Alfred's translations to Chaucer's poetry traced not just linguistic evolution, but the reawakening of collective identity. The church, too, was evolving. The monastic grandeur of earlier centuries gave way to mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, who walked barefoot through market squares preaching repentance. Their sermons in the vernacular brought faith to common ears and sowed the first seeds of dissent that would centuries later bloom into Reformation. Pilgrimage remained central to devotion, but it also became a form of storytelling. From Canterbury to St. David's, from Glastonbury to Walsingham, travelers traded tales, mingling history with miracle, until every shrine was both holy place and narrative stage. In these shared journeys, the island's people, once divided by tribe and tongue, met as equals before the mysteries of life and death. Politically, the great houses of Plantagenet England turned their gaze across the Channel. The 100 Years' War bound England and France in a dance of ambition and fatigue. Kings claimed thrones abroad, even as unrest brewed at home. Yet within this conflict, the idea of England itself crystallized. Knights rode beneath banners bearing the red cross of St. George. Armies sang in a single language. Chroniclers spoke of the realm of the English. The very act of waging foreign war gave shape to domestic unity. What began as the legacy of conquest matured into the consciousness of nationhood. Art and architecture mirrored this synthesis. Gothic cathedrals like York Minster and Salisbury seemed to breathe upward their spires, dissolving into the clouds. The stained glass within them told the island's story in light saints of Ireland, beside Saxon kings apostles, beside warrior queens. In those windows, myth and history coexisted without contradiction. Every shaft of color was a reminder that faith and memory were one. The builders may not have known the names of the ancient Britons or the Roman engineers before them, But their stones stood on the same soil, sharing the same stubborn endurance. Even as towns expanded and universities flourished, rural life retained its rhythm. The customs of sowing harvest and winter feasting carried echoes of older rites. The Yule logged the maypole, the midsummer fire, all remnants of pre-Christian ritual, survived within Christian calendar as harmless joy. Britain had learned not to erase its past, but to fold it inward. Its strength lay not in purity, but in layering faith upon myth, Saxon upon Celt Latin upon English. Each generation added meaning without obliterating what came before. By the 15th century, memory itself had become the kingdom's inheritance. The chroniclers who once wrote in cloisters now served royal archives. Poets who sang of Arthur now praised Henry and Richard. Yet through the changing faces of power, the island's deeper narrative persisted. It was no longer the story of tribes and conquests, but of continuity. How every wave of invaders had ultimately been absorbed into the land they claimed. The Romans built roads, the Saxons villages, the Vikings towns, the Normans cathedrals, and together they had created a civilization bound not by blood, but by belonging. The forgotten origins of medieval Britain did not vanish beneath empire. They became the soil of its endurance. The sacred groves, the Roman stones, the monastic candles, the sailors' oaths, all were fragments of one long conversation between past and present. The people who lived in the later Middle Ages walked unknowingly atop millennia of buried memory. Every plowshare that turned the earth unearthed the bones of those who had shaped it. Every bell that tolled in a church tower echoed faintly against the stones of Hadrian's Wall. And so the story of Britain's medieval heart closes not in conquest, but in quiet continuity. What began as scattered tribes along misty shores ended as a nation with a single language and a shared imagination. The mystery of its origin lies not in lost kingdoms or vanished gods, but in endurance itself, the ability of a people to absorb every storm and rise transformed. Beneath its cathedrals and cottages alike, the ground still hums with the memory of those who first called it home.